make only a brief introduction. So you have a title of our presentation on the screen, and the structure will start with the short historical description of conceptual analysis, namely various conceptual analysis, the history of philosophy in the last 100 years. But that will be very brief, and then we devote more attention to Frank Jackson and his conception of conceptual analysis, without going into technical details of the Canberra style conceptual analysis, but rather concentrate with the famous distinction of modest and immodest conceptual analysis. Then we try to apply this distinction to the analysis of concept denoting human institutions. Then trying to answer the question whether there's such analysis is modest or immodest, or rather, as we try to argue, that is modest analysis yielding modest results. But there's also, we have too many slides, so we skip quite a lot of them. I'm afraid we have to skip all slides relating to Luca Bugazzi's theory, but we have all heard Luca on Monday, so that would be simply a repetition of that. Yeah, that would be a repetition of that what he presented to us on Monday. So that, I don't think that would be a loss for the audience. Adam Dyrda will be the main speaker. I will interrupt him from time to time to make malicious comments. If you want to ask questions, make comments during the presentation, free to do that. The only risk that we run is that we don't complete the presentation. We must finish on time because we don't want to miss the boat taking us to the dinner for the teaching staff. So that is our priority, not to miss this boat. So Adam, please.
Yeah, thanks. So the main question I would like to start with is why bother with conceptual analysis, or more generally with talking about the philosophical method. But this question could be addressed very briefly in the following way. Well, philosophy differs from other ordinary enterprises because usually all philosophers have to explain what are they doing in the first place before they even start doing it, right? So philosophers justify their method before they start using this method very often. It is probably because, you know, the first order questions of philosophy are dependent upon the second order problems of philosophy, which are basically methodological. This is very different in other disciplines. I don't know, medical doctors don't think about how to do medicine, they just do it, right? Ordinary people, when they do things, they just do it. When they fail, then they start to think about why the failure occurred, and then maybe some methodological issues arise. But in case of philosophers, it's very, very different. That's why the concern about the philosophical method, especially conceptual analysis, was probably one of the main issues in the recent history of philosophy, which cannot be summarized in 5 minutes, but I'll try to do so. So there will be just a bunch of ideas that were presented regarding the question of what is conceptual analysis, or what conceptual analysis amounts to. The oldest one is the regressive analysis, basically the idea that we start from some basic axioms and then develop them into some theory. So basically, for example, Euclid was a good example of someone who built a theory, so to say, a principatis a principio, right? But this is a kind of a more constructive method in the sense that we're starting from something, we assume some basic principle and then develop a theory. So then we could say, well, if we have this theory made, we can just turn back to the basic principles to see what rooted this theory. Then later, the very popular account was the compositional analysis. You know, the idea is that we have composed concepts. We very often use very composed concepts, but we can decompose them into more simple ideas. For example, Kant is his very interesting but often neglected book on logic says, focus only on these features that constitute the concept in question, right? Or, for example, Henry Haberley Price, the 20th century epistemologist from Great Britain, wrote, analysis makes clear to us what we already know because we just try to analyze these concepts or this knowledge that we already have. So these ideas that are in some relations, that's what we do. So that very popular examples of this decompositional analysis related to simple statements like human is a rational animal, Dixon is a female fox, bachelor is an unmarried man, knowledge is a justified true belief, and so on. As we all know, this kind of analysis, which were compared by Lichtenberg, an 18th century German aphorist and philosopher, and also a physicist to some extent, to analytical chemistry, right? But this view was contested. There were many objections starting from the late 19th century. Then positivists, logical positivists, I mean, also the other way of critique from, for example, late Wittgenstein, Popper, many others. Then Quine, who basically said the same what logical positivists said, but using different vocabulary with more rhetorics, the greater rhetoric, and so on and so on. So in context of this critique, some philosophers started to think about maybe changing the idea of thinking about the analysis. So, for example, they turned to transformational, connective analysis, which were somehow related also to the account of paraphrases, as developed, for example, by Jerry Bentham in the 19th century. Just to give you a glimpse, for example, Gizbert Ryle, the aim of analysis is to rectify the logical geography of the knowledge which we already possess, but he emphasized that the elucidation of the relationship between these ideas or concepts that we already have must assume that they are not basic or fundamental in any sense, right? So there was an implication that, well, this geography could be made in a variety of ways, basically, by means of different basic concepts or assumed concepts. Or, for example, John Wisdom, an introduction to science. This is a longer one, but this is actually, I chose this quotation because it is in it is contrary, it opposes the idea of analysis as analytical chemistry that was just quoted a minute before. An introduction to a science such as chemistry will contain a selection of the easier and more fundamental chemical truths. In my opinion, says Wisdom, there cannot be such an introduction to analytic philosophy, for there is no special set of analytic truths. Analytic philosophy has no special subject matter. You can philosophize about Tuesday, the pound sterling, and lozenges, and philosophy itself. This is because the analytic philosopher, unlike the scientist, is not one who learns new truths, but one who gains new insight into old truths, and so on, and so on. So there are certain old truths, certain facts, which facts, then we'll discuss it a little bit later, that serve as certain evidence for philosophizing. Obviously, not the full evidence for philosophical claims, because just to quote, for example, Timothy Williamson, evidence is not neutral in the sense that there's always, a philosopher always says more than evidence allows him to say, and evidence will never be able, any evidence, in fact, be able to solve or answer ultimately philosophical questions. Yeah. So I will not go into the details of the other problems. I just want to point out one important thing, I think, namely the fact that most analysis could be taken, most analysis discussed or criticized or performed by philosophers in the late 20th century could be seen as analyses that are to some extent constructive or normative. Namely, philosophers were not only concerned with showing how language works, they were not only trying to reconstruct the way the concepts were used, the meaning of terms, which was obviously to some extent also a suspicious thing, meanings, concepts, and so on, intentions. But they also tried to, they analyzed concepts in order to show how language should be used in order to achieve certain ends, how concepts could be clarified in order to achieve something also not only in science, but also, for example, in institutional reality. So that's why I introduced this problem here, because I think it's an important insight into what philosophers are doing. And this is actually connected with the idea that, you know, the basic words that were the kind of the backbone for philosophical analysis or conceptual analysis for a century or so, were analytic, synonymous, and so on. But these words are actually also philosophers' words. So, and they also need clarification and so on. Once you clarify them, then you can use them, but in order to achieve something while constructing your conceptual scheme or whatever. So now I'm going to turn to Frank Jackson's idea, who is trying to revive or defend conceptual analysis against basically most attacks that are post-Quinian, I would say, in kind. So he says conceptual analysis is a kind of paraphrasis, basically, which is a kind of an armchair attempt, he says, but you need to collect some evidence earlier in order to start it. And this evidence is, as he says, fault theory, right? Well, basically, conceptual analysis could have various kinds of evidence, but this could be my intuitions, for example, your own intuitions. Many philosophers just rely on what they think or what they call intuition. This is also a kind of metaphysically or just troublesome thing, this intuition, because nobody could define it very well. So Frank Jackson says, well, let's start from something more describable, I would say, or identifiable. And he says this is the fault theory. Namely, the conceptual theory of ordinary common sense. It need not be specified fully and explicitly, and indeed it usually is not. At some point, Frank Jackson says, if you don't know what the fault theory is, because it also may be debatable, let's make a survey in the class, for example, then you're going to glimpse of what the fault theory is. So maybe there is some empirical investigation that has to be done, but we can discuss it later. Then he says the conceptual analysis is an attempt to locate the meaning of terms of one theory in terms of another theory by means of testing intuition against possible cases. So usually it would be an attempt to locate the meaning of terms of fault theory in terms of a more sophisticated special theory, for example, a theory, a more naturalistic theory, or maybe in case of theory of artifacts, a philosophical theory or something that tells or introduces terms which are better suited to make the to make explicit this fault theory. It is supposed to be like Quine's or Benthamian's paraphrase. We take the fault theory, which is a very raw theory, a very raw material, metaphysically suspicious, and we try to translate it, tell the same story about a certain thing, a certain object, a certain K, in a metaphysically acceptable vocabulary, and so on. So, but the interesting point about this procedure of analysis, which Jackson claims to be a kind of a widely used method, not only within philosophy, but in a wider context, is that it is divided into two steps, actually. So at first, he says there's a purely, let's say, semantic step where philosopher is reconstruing a given thought concept in light of possible cases, and he calls it a modest step. But then one can try, but this is not a necessary step. The first step is necessary, but the second step is not necessary. And this is the immodest step that boils down to answering the question of whether such an analysis of a concept tells us something about the object or property that is believed to correspond with the concept. So whether it tells us something about reality itself, not merely about the way we classify things or not merely the way we understand things, but also about how this understanding is connected to the real thing, and then this immodest step would tell us something about the world itself. Jackson himself argues that we should be suspicious of the conceptual analysis in its immodest role, namely performing the second step. So he says, let's be more hesitant or reluctant and just focus on the first step, and then we'll be good philosophers. He believes that it must not be given this immodest analysis a role in determining the fundamental nature of our world. So he just says analysis is not a good tool to describe what the world is. Probably the better tool is science for that. Now our question related to this enterprise of our related to our inquiry into conceptual analysis in the context of institutions is what do we do when we analyze concepts of institutional artifacts, and whether, as Tomasz said earlier, whether the analysis is, or at least could be, immodest when we perform this task. So I already said about these two roles, but so I don't want, this is not controversial. So I can skip the slides, or
no, just I think it's important to
stress maybe again. So yeah, just a short reconsideration. So immodest analysis gives us insight into what the world is like, independent of our linguistic practices and conceptual frameworks. It is an analysis of the content of our concept that yields truth about the essential characteristics of the referent to which the concept is supposed to refer. And the last quotation coming from Leiter and Dixon from their exchange in 2011, so more relevant to our discussions. Analyzing the way we talk about, use, and apply our concepts will yield knowledge not merely of those concepts themselves, but of what the world is like, of the reality those concepts attempt to conceptualize. Right? So immodest conceptual analysis yield results regarding the world itself, not merely regarding our understanding, whereas modest conceptual analysis is the elucidation of the possible situations covered by the words we use to ask our questions. It's supposed to illuminate our concepts, our thoughts and talk, not the referent we might have intended to understand. Leiter himself says this type of analysis will deliver an understanding only of our concepts and will be ethnographically relative. Right? So this is a kind of a local enterprise. He said it is just a glorified lexicography, but as far as I know, analytic philosophers defend themselves from this view. They're saying, well, no, it's not lexicography. Lexicography is kind of a more scrutiny of the meanings of words, not necessarily connected that deeply to the shared understanding and all these relations that occur between terms used. Why this is important? Why should we wonder about whether the concept like law can be analyzed in a modest or immodest way? Well, because, at least because some legal philosophers referred to this distinction when they discussed the results their own analysis provided, or when they tried to describe what other philosophers, legal philosophers, were doing. So, for example, Kanhima says, Dworkin deploys an immodest conceptual analysis, whereas positivism deploys a modest conceptual analysis. On the other hand, Ian Farrell describes Hart's positivism as engaging in modest conceptual analysis, which is, by the way, quite controversial, because if we take this basic quotation from Austin, quoted at the very beginning of the concept of law, that the sharpened awareness of our words sharpen our awareness of the phenomena, it would suggest that the result should be rather immodest, sharpened awareness of the phenomena itself, right? That's why probably Leiter and Langliners say that generally analytical jurisprudence done in the Hart's, Razian, and so on, similar way, deploys immodest conceptual analysis, but there is no thorough, I would say, consistent argument for this. A very nice argument was provided by Stefan Sciaraffa, I believe, who is quite similar to our argument, but differs in some details. Maybe we'll be able to get to that. And there's also, and he says that analysis is immodest in certain part of the, with respect to certain types of the concept, he says, refers to the particular concepts of law, or concepts of particular laws, but not general concept of law. Our view is slightly different. Well, we think it's more applies to the general, not the particular, so maybe it's very different, but the idea is that there is something immodest in the content of the concept, in the analysis of some part of the concept. And there is also Shapiro, who actually refers to this type of conceptual analysis. He makes a footnote to Frank Jackson in his book Legality, but he does not answer the question what is actually the result of his analysis. So there's some more work to be done about this, maybe some more hermeneutical work. Yeah. So our preliminary suggestion before I turn to the second part of the presentation is that the analysis of artifact concepts, as discussed by, for example, Luca or Ken earlier, bring always a sort of an inevitable, immodest result, because in case of artifacts, certain folk views are essential for determining the characteristics of this artifact. So folk theory, to some extent, that would be a very thin extent, as you will see, fix the reference of an general institutional terms, institutional kinds, I should write. So, and define the features of the kind. So once you analyze them, you get immodest results inevitably. Thus, by reconstructing and revealing these essential parts of the folk theory from an artifact, we tell something about the artifactual world, not merely about our conceptual practices. But before I turn to the second part, there's one qualification. We don't think that our metaphilosophical inquiries over whether it's modest or immodest, are themselves immodest. Rather, we assume that, for example, there is some truth in Luca's theory, and then we can try to think whether Luca's theory brings immodest results, or any other theory that relies to some extent on Serlin account of institutional theory. So that's why I won't be repeating what has been already said so many times on Monday, Tuesday, today. So this is basically my reading, our reading of Luca. That's fine. A little bit Crow as well. I know I should rely only on you, but I think since you did a similar thing, so we don't have to quote this here in greater extent. That's why we're gonna go basically to the second part, to the folk theories of law, right? Or the role folk beliefs play in constructing legal theory. Luca himself wrote that basically the concept of law is a practical concept. It's our departure point. This is a folk concept or a non-propositional conceptual understanding. So I take him to argue for a kind of a folk base of this of the theory of artifacts. And the similar thing applies to Hart or Joseph Raz. For example, Herbert Hart explicitly refers in the beginning of his magisterial work, The Concept of Law, to the common knowledge of educated people who are able to identify salient features of law, at least in a skeletal manner. And then he states, those who are most perplexed by the question, what is law, have not forgotten and need no reminder that the familiar facts which the skeleton answer offers them. So there are some familiar facts everybody knows about, and this is the basic departure point for analyzing the concept of
but it's just folk theory.
And this is just what we call folk theory. Joseph Raz argues the notion of law as designating a type of social institution is not part of the scholarly apparatus of any learned discipline. It is not a concept introduced by academics to help with explaining some social phenomena. Rather, it is a concept entrenched in our society's self-understanding. It is a common concept in our society and one which is not a preserve of any specialized discipline. It occupies a central role in our understanding of society, our own, as well other societies, So it has some universal, there's some universalization or universal context here. Then he says it is part of our self-consciousness, and so on and so on. And for example, as I said, Scott Shapiro, to whom I referred before, also says that we must start from certain platitudes or truisms about law in order to produce a theory or in order to analyze the concept of law. And he says that he starts from the following list of truisms and platitudes, which he presumably takes to be a kind of universal basis for building any theory. So he says, in assembling a list of truisms about law, the legal philosopher must include truisms about basic legal institutions, like all legal systems have judges or courts interpret the law. Then legal norms, like some laws are rules, some laws impose obligations, or for example, laws are always members of legal systems. Then legal authority, like legal authority is conferred by legal rules, or in every legal system, some person or institution has supreme authority to make certain laws. Then motivation. Simply knowing that the law requires one to act in a certain way does not motivate one to act in that way. Or, for example, it is possible to obey the law even though one does not think that one is morally obliged to do so, etc. And then objectivity, there are right answers to some legal questions. Courts sometimes make mistakes when interpreting the law. Some people know more about the law than others, and so on. And so this is like a commonplace in the theory of law, especially analytical theory of law, analytical theory of institution, that the folk theory of some kind is the point of departure for philosophizing. So any conceptual enterprise must depend on the folk theory. But we, and this is our contribution now, think that it would be good to discriminate between two types of folk theory of law, basically. By folk theory, you would understand all the shared common beliefs about law, shared mainly by lay people, or maybe some lay but experienced people as Hart wanted, right? People who had dealt with law in their lives to some extent, or had some idea, or and they are educated enough to have at least a rough idea about what law could be. So we think that it would be good to discriminate between the general folk theory of law, which consists of all these kinds of platitudes about law, but then understanding that, well, some of these platitudes might be false, like in older times when people thought that some laws are basically made by God, for example. Even though that was a platitude, probably that was a false platitude because these laws were made by officials or by some clerics or whatever, right? Bishops, etc. So that's why we think it should be possible to discriminate between the false and true part of the folk theory. But there's also one thing we should discriminate and think about, namely the platitudes that could be could play some role in determining the essential features of the artifact, namely those features that are supposed to be connected with this intentionality, collective intentionality, because it must be rooted in something and related to something. And those other features, those other beliefs of folk, which are, well, contingent to some extent. And there's also a difference between the beliefs about law, widely shared beliefs of law that are related to all laws to some extent, which are universal, so to say, as Joseph Raz would like it to be, and others that would not pertain to the kind of an artifact, but rather to some more kind of particular types in given specific jurisdiction or culture or something like this. That's why we say there must be something that might be called the foundational folk theory, namely the set of platitudes holding which is necessary for a group to share a collective intentionality, rather, and beliefs that are able to create an institutional artifact of a certain kind. Okay, we would suggest that in case of the theory that depends on this functional characteristic of a kind, that would be best to understand this essential characteristic in terms of basic function and functions and artifacts should play. So, because this is the folk who creates in the most general way the institution like law, the folk also knows the most basic functions this institution is supposed to play. But it is, of course, not to say that the folk knows all the functions, or because, not only because, well, also because, for example, some functions might be revealed during some historical period in time, whatever. But certain basic functions, like, I don't know, coordination of behavior or solving social conflicts has to be known in advance, because these are people who are architects of the whole institutional machinery we're talking about here. And because one of the problems that has been that used to be and is probably often discussed in relation to theories of law is the problem of error, and especially the problem of global error, we would say that if the reliance on folk theory is right here, I would say, in the sense that it is really the folk theory that sets the grounds for both determining and then back for analyzing the concept of law or such other general institutional artifacts, then the foundational folk theory cannot be false, right? But this is a kind of our interpretation of what could that foundational folk theory be. And the general folk theory, moreover, can be at least partially false, because, as I said, it might comprise of some false beliefs about the institution, vindicated, justified, but false regarding given the context, circumstances, and time. Right? So we focus on the foundational folk theory that cannot be false, not on the general folk theory. Yeah.
Just when you say cannot be false, do you mean it's necessarily true? Is that what you mean?
Well,
No, because I don't think that beliefs that are parts of a folk theory are necessarily true. They are just contingently true. But that, for example, you know, that belief that could you go back to Sapiro list of platitudes? So some of them, that's a matter of fact whether they are true or not. You know, if a part of the folk theory is that the law is divine creation, but that's quite simply false. But it's not necessarily false, or is it?
Right.
Or if people believe that the bulk of law that was a paper found in a cave somewhere, you know, and then somebody took this paper from the cave and announced that the law. You know, so that is historically false, but that's a part of the folk theory, not part of this general folk theory, and not a part of foundational theory.
Okay, so what do you mean by when saying that the foundational folk theory cannot be false?
That is, I think Adam is going to explain that in a few minutes.
Well, yeah.
Because otherwise we would not have K, that wouldn't be law. Now let us, for example, if we believe, for example, that the key function of law is to coordinate behavior. I don't know whether true or false, but just an example. So then, if we have something that does not coordinate behavior of people, that is not law. It does not belong to the key genre.
Well, actually, I got this slide on Searle here, related to this issue. So, for example, Searle writes, as long as people continue to recognize the X as having the Y status function, the institutional fact is created and maintained. They do not, in addition, have to recognize that they are so recognizing, and they may hold all sorts of other beliefs, false beliefs about what they are doing and why they are doing it. And he says the participants may accept the imposition of function only because of some related theory which might not even be true. So this is, for example, the case of assuming some transcendent authority who produced certain types of law, gave some papers, whatever, right? Often he says the institution functions best when people hold false beliefs about it. So he's even more radical. He says that, well, this is a kind of a practical need to have false beliefs.
So people tend to observe law when they believe that's a divine creation. So that's this false belief sort of induces people to follow legal rules.
But then there is also another problem, which is here suggested by Eric Lagerspitz, namely the problem that, well, before people, first of all, before people start to recognize something, they hold false beliefs about this thing if we take this, all these institutional mechanics for granted, right? So this is one thing, but we don't want to consider this case because we assume that we are analyzing the concept, living concept of an institution, right? And this is also dependent on the account of recognition that you got, because you can avoid this problem if you rely on some other account of recognition, not really the account that says, well, you need to have more, I don't know, 50% of people recognizing something in order to, in order for it to exist, right? But the other thing is that certain false beliefs in certain circumstances can become true, and this might be also the case of certain beliefs which are embedded in general folk theory, but they're like contingent in our sense, well, not necessarily true. Well, that is what I meant when I said, well, certain functions of an artifact might start to be recognized at some point later during the historical evolution of the institution, but this will be some kind of supplement to the basic basic beliefs about functions which at the first place founded the institution. which then developed, but still I believe the basic functions has to be in place if there is any foundational folk theory, because they, I don't know, they might be none. I'm not saying that this analysis has a modest result. It's just a kind of a speculation about what happens, what happens in what kind of analysis and what happens when we think about folk theory in institutional theory. So there are two types of false beliefs of folk theory, such that cannot become true in any case, and such that can become true. And the foundational folk theory comprises neither of these. Namely, it comprises of beliefs that are basically true because they became true when somebody constructed, recognized the institution at first, and there's no way to get away from this, in a sense. And yeah, so I'm not, we don't really, how much time do we have?
No, it's
a
half
hour.
Half an hour.
Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the Brian Leiter's idea of the hermeneutic concept, and then try to reconcile it with the idea that that we have, right? So Brian Leiter says that the hermeneutic concept is the concept whose reference is fixed by the role it plays in how people make sense of themselves and their social world. But he says that if the concept of law is hermeneutic in this sense, a modest conceptual analysis, which basically makes sense of people's own understanding about the law, will yield immodest results. But then he says, but natural kind concepts have an epistemic and pragmatic priority over the hermeneutic concepts. It's science who is the greatest reference point for determining whether things have essences. So, and we cannot, he says, we cannot simply discover any essence of law understood as hermeneutic concepts. And then he argues that, well, that's why the analysis cannot actually yield immodest results. So any attempt to do this would be a kind of a failure on the side of the analysis. But he says, well, but he agrees that if the concept is hermeneutic in the sense, the modest analysis might yield immodest results. And this is actually what we are trying to say when we analyze this analytical discourse. Namely, we say there is a part of folk theory about law that cannot be false, as being a part of self-understanding that was built into this collective intentionality that helped to bring an artifact into an existence. And we also claim that if this is the case, the analysis of the concept of law would be an analysis of a hermeneutic concept, and it will reveal certain necessary truths about law, at least in part in which such analysis is concerned with the platitudes that originally were able to substantially determine that collective intentionality constitutive of law as social artifact. And I said there is a lot of connections in the way of thinking, also of our way of thinking with Stefan Sciaraffa, who also wrote that the analysis of the concept of law would have the immodest result. Because, to quote, intuition-guided conceptual analysis of law is simultaneously an analysis of our shared understanding of law and of the law itself, for our concept of law constitutes the reality of law. That's what he says, and he also has in mind this practical concept of law. Because we have time, I probably, and I have like last 3 slides, I'm gonna share this argument with you. Well, Sciaraffa says the following thing. he argues that the analysis, the modest results pertain to the particular concept of law and not the general concept of law. Namely, he says, there are many particular concepts of law or concepts of legal norms. For example, the particular concept of law of the United States picks out one set of norms, like the enactments of the US legislature, and the particular concept of the law of the United Kingdom picks out another set of norms, like the enactments of Parliament, and so on. And he differentiates this particular concept with the general concept, qua-legal norm, which subsumes all norms picked out by the particular concept of law. For example, the enactment of the British and American legislators are both laws in this general sense, whereas the rules of Major League Soccer in the United States and the Premier League in the United Kingdom are not, and this is a more general matter. We think that it would be better to reverse the picture, because if we try to construe the foundational fault theory, it must pertain to the most general kind of an object, and then we can of course differentiate, for example, between the concept of the general kind, like law, and then particular concepts, I would say types of an institution, and then even tokens, as it was discussed earlier, and it's discussed by Sell and many others. But the idea is that any type of an institution would have a more robust characteristic than any general kind, right? And that would mean that any kind dependent upon of the one thing, any kind of a K of an institutional artifact would have a certain kind of necessary characteristic fixed by the common intentionality, right? And if we have this, and also the fault theory, and we say this way, it would mean that the characteristic of the kind is very thin in comparison to the characteristic of the types and particular things. That's why we think if we discriminate between this fault necessary true foundational theory and general kinds, then we can and general kinds and more robust general fault theory, contingent beliefs about contingent functions, and so on and so on, then we can think, well, we should reverse the picture that Sciarra presents, because the only immodest result the analysis of the fault theory found is that the result that pertains to the foundational fault theory. So this is something that refers to the most essential basic characteristic of the whole kind, and not concrete loss, right? So the concept of concrete loss. I'm not sure if I understand Sciarra correctly on this point, but I think this, if I present him this way, we are in opposition to him. So that's always something, right? To find your way, your place in the philosophical spectrum. Okay, so 2 more slides, and there's a kind of test that we can make in order to, well, check whether analysis is modest or immodest. This test actually shows that the discrimination between modest and immodest analysis is inaccurate, at least in context of certain types of concepts, which goes against the general idea of Frank Jackson that we should talk about 2 roles of the conceptual analysis. Maybe we should talk about 2 types of concepts and then about different types of roles. But the idea is this: in case of the general concept of law, whether you want to do a modest or immodest conceptual analysis of the concept of law on the basis of the fault theory, and then considering this foundational part of the fault theory, you will always receive the same result. So there's no point in discriminating between modest or immodest, because even during the first step, you're going to achieve the results of the second step, right? A set of claims that are true about law as it was brought into existence about, let's say, we intentionality as related to this fault, the foundational fault theory. This, let's say, intuitions, but this fault beliefs passed the test of also, to some extent, as seen from the historical perspective of empirical accuracy, because people started to recognize thing as a thing, artifact as an artifact, and then because they both contributed to its existence and then took it, well, understand it in their own way. That's why we basically discussed in a wider paper with Leiter, who does not want to say this kind of things, and he says that the folk intuitions about law are unreliable. Well, if this is true, they're totally reliable, but the question is which part of the folk theory is this foundational folk theory, how to discriminate between all folk beliefs and this foundational, basic, necessary, true, let's say, in some sense of the word, or maybe not, but inevitably true, true beliefs. And this is a serious problem, obviously, because it might depend on the on different conceptions of what is essential for law to exist. We take it to be some functional characteristics, but that might be highly contestable. So eventually, this is the conclusion. The distinction between modest and immodest conceptual analysis does not apply to the foundational analysis of law, in the sense I described earlier, of law as understood as hermeneutic concept. And for example, if we take Ken Hima's characterization of this distinction between modest and immodest, which he proposed in context of analyzing the concept of law himself, we can say the following. Modest conceptual analysis can result in limited errors, but cannot result in global error. For we cannot be thoroughly mistaken with respect to the content of our own ideas and understanding, but this is just a modest claim about whether we understand whether we understand our own conceptualizations of things, right? Not whether we understand the world. And immodest conceptual analysis can result in global error, since what the world really like is not in general dependent on what we think about it and how we conceptualize possibilities. Unless, and here is the crux, we determine the reality to some extent. If we do so, then in case of conceptual analysis relay aimed at the foundational fault theory, we cannot make global error, and we cannot find out what is at least partially, we can find out what is at least partially the nature of the object to which the concept referred to, since we created the very object by means of our conceptual practice. So we determine and discover at the same time what the institutional world in part is really like. And of course, one might say we're assuming too much here, like the social artifacts are in fact a part of the furniture of the world, so there's some kind of realism in the context and so on and so on. But as I said earlier, this is only our understanding of what happens when one accepts the Serlin-like account, realistic account of institutional artifact, right? So I don't know if you buy it. You might even wonder, why should we be concerned about these questions? As I said, because philosophers ask these kinds of questions when they start doing the work. Maybe you should start your own work in analyzing certain concepts of artifacts by asking this kind of questions. But I don't know if you buy our solution. There are three possibilities, I believe. It might be all well and good and true. It might be a prank, or it might be a kind of provocation. So now, please tell us, what do you think? Which?
And it might be incomprehensible. So
well, that's also, but I cannot. Yeah.
That would be the worst scenario for us.
All right, so we have like 25 minutes probably for discussion. Yeah.
Are there any criteria on the basis of which one can decide what belongs to the foundational fault theory and what belongs to the general fault theory? You think about these criteria?
Very good question, other than others. So, well, I think this is better. You are talking about that is we have artifact zone K. So the question is, what makes something K? So I think that foundational fault theory just determines those elements or those features something must have in order to be K. That would be my answer. But of course, K may have also other features. So this general fault theory may describe falsely or correctly other features of K. And now the question is, what makes something law? I would like to have an answer to this question, but I don't. I can recognize law from non-law, but anyhow, I don't know how I do that. What is really foundational and what is only contingent.
Yeah, thanks. So I guess when I was asking about the necessarily true, I guess what you mean by cannot be false is something like it's constitutively true or something like that.
That is a problem, because another very different question is what necessary means in the context of legal theory. When Ras, Dixon, Shapiro, and others say that they want to discover the nature of law as a set of necessary features of law. So I have major problems with answering the question, what necessity, what sort of necessity that, if we go through Kit Fine, distinction of various sorts of necessity, is certainly it's not any of them. So in my opinion, I once wrote a paper on that, but so far it has been published only as of the legal theory claim to necessity. So I think that when they talk about necessity, they adopt a very weak understanding of necessity. We have a fault theory, and then we ask the question, what features the law must have to make the fault theory true. For example, distinction between primary and secondary rules. That is not a part of the fault theory. Fault does not think those terms. But there's a platitude of the belonging to fault theory that law persists in time. Famous example of Hart. King Rex I dies, and his successor is King Rex II. So does the law disappear? No, it doesn't. It still persists. But how to explain that? So then Hart says, in order to explain that, we must make this distinction between primary and secondary rules. Once we make this distinction, we can explain the platitude that law persists in time. So it's in this sense that is necessary that law is composed of both types of rules, but that is a very weak sort of necessity. If there would be no such, if there's no such distinction, we wouldn't be able to explain why law persists in time. So that's what they had in mind. And they try to avoid answering this question. Ras says, I'm not able to explain in this place what I mean by necessity. There's not a citation from, but there's very sort of citation from Ras. Julie Dixon does the same. There's only, I found only one paper, as I remember, Brian Biggs once wrote a paper ras on necessity, but I don't quite remember what, because I read it something like 10 years ago, so I don't remember what was in this paper. So certainly it's not nomological necessity, not logical necessity, probably also not metaphysical necessity. So that is extremely unclear what necessary in this context means.
But I was actually going to sort of, for listening, I was going to contest you on the fact that you're assuming that there are artifacts, for instance, that you mentioned it in the end, but in a way of making some assumptions. And I was wondering that if you then say that we can discover some of the features, of the functions of law, because those functions follow, in a way, necessarily, but from the fault concept, and the fault concept includes certain functions. Mm-hmm. But then couldn't you then contest that by saying that, well, what if law actually is not that kind of an artifact that has functions?
Good question. So then probably there must be something what turns an object into law. You know, that based we have this artifact also of law, and there must be something what allows to say that is law. So it does not have to be a function, but what else could it be? We rather tend to think that it's a function. Yeah?
Well, yeah, because for example, let's take this platitude that law persists over time. Mm-hmm. Hart explains it out in terms of different kinds of rules, but it is not a part of the fault theory anymore, what he does. I know his explanation does not refer to fault theory anymore, but it also relies on some other folk platitudes that might be foundational, which are even more essential than the idea that law persists over time. Because why law persists over time? Because otherwise it wouldn't, for example, it couldn't perform certain functions. But what functions are these? I don't know. Probably coordination,
or justifying coercion or whatever. Yeah.
But the problem with this kind of foundation, and now we suggest, let's take all these most basic ideas that would agree with most explanations probably, or theories or analysis of the concept of law presented in the discourse, because this is what we actually suggest. Because even for manifold reasons, for example, because if a theoretician does not refer to the foundation of fault theory, he or she would probably discuss a different object than others, so they're going to speak one past another, and this would not be a genuine discussion, but just a kind of vocabulary issue, I would say, verbal dispute, right? So if you want to avoid a verbal dispute, you need to have something foundational. But now the question is what it really is. So, and we are concerned about this. Our idea is that this is usually mostly functional.
Which function?
But which function should dominate? Maybe neither. Maybe there's a kind of, maybe you could explain, maybe that would be a kind of better development of our idea if you think of this basic functions as embedded in folk theory as those which are actually a kind of a bundle, or how to say, a kind of, and only they would be a cluster. They would be essentially related to one another, but for example, in certain folk views of one community or in one culture, the feature A would be present, but in the other folk community, the most important would be feature B, and so on and so on. But then that's the role of the analyst, who has to think about the implications of the folk beliefs to establish whether this is the same folk theory here and there, because it could be the same, but people are just thinking about different functions the most important. So that might explain somehow why there are different tastes between theorists saying, well, the most important is coordination. Well, it's not. The most important is, I don't know, guidance in a slightly different sense. Some would say it's
Brian says that law does not have any function at all, any necessary function at all. It could have any also.
no other necessary features either.
So this is a serious challenge, but maybe, yeah.
Anyway, it looks very
But
promising.
yeah, but well, but also the suggestion standing behind all of this is, as I said, well, when you're doing the conceptual analysis of the concept like law, think yourself about whether there is such a foundational folk theory you could refer to. If there's not, maybe you're, well, I don't know what you're doing, but still there might be some fun in it. Yeah. Yeah.
Michał Czarkowski, University. I'd like to refer to your claim that the distinction between primary and secondary rules is necessary for law, because I think it may be problematic for some reasons. Because what if we provide an alternative explanation of these latitudes concerning persisting law over time? If we may provide such an alternative explanation, then I believe we may say that this distinction between primary and secondary rules is not key or essential.
But you are absolutely right. So first of all, Hartwig said that it's not a part of the concept of law. It does not say that if there's a system of rules that does not contain both primary and secondary rules, that is not law. Hartwig denies that. He says only that the developed legal system usually contain both types of this. So in that sense, it's not necessary for law. So I think that, second, that is a problem of universality and parochiality of legal theory. That is this famous distinction, this famous statement made by Joseph Russ that legal theory is both universal and parochial, and is parochial not when it fails to be universal. And namely that the legal theory is always connected with certain culture. Russ, as an Anglo-Saxon lawyer, looks at the law from the position of this legal culture. And then he says, I may apply my concept of law to any culture, but that would be my concept of law. In this sense, that it is my concept of law that is rooted in a given culture, legal theory is parochial. But as it may be applied to any normative system, so then in this sense it is universal. Of course, there's a lot of problem with that, because that would mean that, for example, let us say somewhere in Polynesia, there's a group of legal theorists that develop a legal theory from the position of their culture. So they may say something about English or Croatian or Polish legal system, something very different than we do, because they look at the law from the position, from the perspective of their culture. So that's a sort of, I would say, of imperialism of Western legal theory, that we tend to think that all laws must be somehow similar to that what we have in this cultural environment. But you are absolutely true. There could be other explanations of persistence of legal systems. So in that sense, certainly it's not a necessary distinction in the strong sense.
But don't you think that this is a threat for this distinction between foundational and the general folk theory? Because I believe it may be a consequence of this possibility of alternative explanation, that that every platitude can be explained in another way, and as such we can say that there is no necessary platitudes about, for example, the concept of law.
There's a general methodological problem, and maybe Platitudes for legal theories, platitudes, that's like a set of empirical data. People believe that law is such, and such. So by empirical data. And then we try to build a theory explaining those data. But that is, you know, indeterminate, this is zbiór danych empirycznych nie określa, że the same set of data may be explained by many theories. That was quite
under
the techniques of theory. So that's not a specific problem of legal theory, but it's a general methodological problem. The same set of data may be explained by the various theories. So I do not feel guilty because it's not my only. We share this problem with sociologists, with physicists, people doing chemistry and medical doctors.
Come on, no more questions? That was quite controversial. So,
I have a question from the University of Warsaw. I have a small question. Is this foundational folk theory a subset of general folk theory?
yeah. In this sense, we understand it.
So this was a funny thing in your presentation because you have written that the general folk theory could be at least partially false.
Yeah, well, general could be partially
Yes,
false, but there is
Only
also
partially, because
Yes, but you use also expression at least.
at least.
Oh, yeah,
So that's so you are right. So yeah.
yeah.
This foundational part must be always true. And that is true by definition, I believe, you know. No, I don't want to open this problem because I don't have any answer.
Well, that's why I said that maybe this is a prank, what we're doing, kind of, you know, everything fits well, but it's analytically true and well.
Yeah, maybe,
Sorry.
maybe I will make some general remark that is addressed rather to our younger colleagues. And maybe that is a general belief that what Hart did, that was a conceptual theory of law, made the kind of ordinary language philosophy, analyzing how people talk, what they mean, and so on and so on. But when you read carefully the concept of law, this type of analysis, as a matter of fact, does not exist in the body of the concept of law. That is this famous passage relating to government situation, and maybe there's a difference between having obligation and being obliged. I could never understand this point, but you know, I thought that that's because of my poor command of English. That for native speakers of English it is clear, but I have several people say, no, we don't understand that at all. We don't understand what could be the semantic difference between having obligation and being obliged. You know, and that is, as a matter of fact, almost the only place where Hart tries to analyze the meanings and the use of certain expressions. What he does, his point of departure is the certain set of platitudes, what he says, common knowledge of educated people, and then tries to develop a theory that explains those platitudes. That is exactly what Jackson proposes. Of course, it does not mean that Hart is following Jackson. That would be historically impossible because concept of law that is 1961 and in defense of conceptual analysis by Jackson is 94 or 96. Anyhow, that's mid-90s. So the book appeared after the death of Hart. But that is just an explanation. So I think that it's good to look at Hart theory through the eyes of Jackson. So I think he's doing exactly that what Jackson proposed. And here, well, slightly concerned because we have one specialist here who knows everything about the Canberra style conceptual analysis, that is Paweł Banaś. So I'm afraid that we step up and say, oh, what you are saying is absolutely false, because a piece of nonsense. Jackson never said so, even if he said he didn't mean that. Are you going to say that, Pierre?
No.
No, okay.
Because the vote is waiting.
Yeah. But yeah.
Maybe a brief question out of curiosity, because I'm not too familiar with the literature in this field, but it strikes me that most approaches that I have heard now are in a way moving from the abstract or starting from the abstract. It seems to me also a bit of a feature of conceptual analysis that you're conceptually analyzing. Whereas, for example, John Michael has done some interesting empirical work showing that, for instance, I think it was like 173 jurisdictions or whatever, all have an identical or very similar prohibition, a material prohibition of intentional killing, so which we might call murder. And is it not also possible, or what are your thoughts on, not starting from the abstract and then moving downwards, but starting from this very concrete, maybe universal agreement that there is a, let's say, prohibition in criminal law of murder, intentional killing, and from that deriving a fault theory of the functions of criminal law? Maybe it is through
I would say that's exactly what Hart did. His minimum content of natural law, that's exactly the idea. He develops, but it's still underdeveloped theory of functions of law. Why is law necessary in a society? But necessary in this common sense, not metaphysically necessary. It must comply with the requirement of this minimum natural law. So I think that's quite right what you said. So that is in the sense very weak, extremely weak sense, a necessary feature of each law that it does contain the prohibition of killing, but not necessary in the metaphysical or nomological sense, necessary in the common sense.
I have a short comment on this. Maybe
you are against.
Well, no, I think what you're saying also is compatible with what what he presented. But I don't know. Maybe the dialectic between us and Stefan Szczeraffa is like, I don't know, cat and mice running around, or I don't know, tortoise and Achilles or whatever kind of situation. Because I think, if you have these practical concepts of certain norms, and you're saying, well, people are aware of this, well, somebody introduced them because of some more familiar backbone belief, for example, that people generally shouldn't be murdered without, I don't know, just court decision or whatever, right? Maybe this is, so I'm thinking like this. Well, the foundational fault theory might still exist in the background, and it might be very thin, pertaining to certain functions. But then that might be an empirical fact about all municipal legal systems in the world, that they have these kinds of prohibitions or types of legal institutions, particular types of legal institutions, which were developed into a certain way, and they all share common features. So you can say where, that's what I suggested earlier, the concept of law is supplemented with certain things, right? But it will be a more robust concept than the one implied by the thin foundational fault theory still. So you can still think whether there's a difference between the basic kind of law or municipal concept of law. Because Hart himself doesn't say, for example, that, well, he analyzes law in general. He says he analyzes the law of the municipal law. So there's still a question whether more primitive forms of law could not be better interpreted in the way we suggest. And also then you could try to analyze the relation between primitive forms of law, concepts of primitive forms of law, and more developed concepts of law. But this is just a suggestion.
The story of how secondary rules came into existence, what were the defects of the system composed of primary rules only, this story is completely false. Some people take it seriously, saying that there's just an ethnography or ethnological description, but those invented by Dyrda and that story.
Just a thought experiment.
Yeah, this is just a thought experiment. And some people take it seriously, but that's, I think, the very interesting paper by John Gardner, the hard problematic terms, or something like that, that he says why it is false.